Hello all, and welcome back to another video. As you can see from the title, I have gone and done it. I have bought myself another classic Honda monkey bike. This one's quite special and it was a bit of a surprise, so let's go over this purchase. So what you are looking at is a Honda CT70. This bike is a US import and it was built in 1969, and that's the first thing that kind of leads to the specialness and the rareness of this bike. So 1969 was the first year these bikes were manufactured, and what's very cool about this one is it is one of the first 2000, and that doesn't sound like a lot. It's an early production model, but what that means, it is referred to as a Silvertag. So a Silvertag is essentially the first 2000 bikes were slightly different to all the others. You can imagine Honda were looking to produce this bike and were maybe off soft tooling and not of their final production parts. So there's a few cool things that stand out, and you wouldn't see it from first glance, but for the Honda fanboys out there, you'll know this is quite a rare bike. Considering its age, the bike is in really good shape. You can see that there's a few broken parts, the paint's pretty poor, and it looks like someone's tried to rattle can the whole bike at some point, but it's mainly there, which is awesome. There's a standard carburetor which came from factory, all the parts are there, but yeah, it's a full bike and it's a great base for another restoration. Some people may say it's a crime to restore this, but I want to have it like new and I want to ride and enjoy it, so the only way to do that is to strip it down and put it back to new. So what makes one of these a so-called Silvertag? The first thing is the chain guard you just seen there being a completely different cutout on the front edge. The hubs, the aluminium castings are completely different, and if you look at the fenders here, although bent, it has a lip in them, and after those first 2000 bikes this changed. They must have moved over to a separate tool. What was also cool is the toolbox or tool storage was underneath the seat, so you get a little fixing point there. I'm missing the tools, but hopefully that's something we can put back right. And you can see underneath the tank, it's pretty tidy. There's surface rust, but all the frame is solid, which is perfect. So I'm sure some of you are thinking, why was it an accident? The reason this bike was an accident was because I never knew it was a Silvertag. It was not advertised as that. It had no frame tag, so you couldn't actually see the physical Silvertag, and it was on eBay. No one bid on it, and I thought, you know what, I've always wanted one. I wanted the American CT versus the ST, so I had to have it. Hope that's given everyone a good background of why this bike is so rare, so cool, and such a fun thing to restore. For today's video, in part 1, we're going to look at getting this thing running. So I'm going to cover all of the things I do with a new project and why it's so important to try and get these bikes running before you tear them apart. With all the tools out on the table, the first thing we're going to take a look at is the spark plug. So the reason I'm pulling this spark plug out is to have a look at the colour of it, the state of it. Is it damaged? Will we see any metal parts? Turns out that it looked pretty normal, just looked like a well-used plug, nice and clean, which is good. Gives a sign that there's no sort of internal piston damage. With that out, we can also just spin the engine over by hand, and it gives you an idea of just that it's all moving smoothly inside. With the spark plug checked and out of the way, we look at oil. Obviously oil is very important for an engine. As with my other engine, the Z50, there was very little oil in it. Doesn't surprise me, a lot of people run these low and don't pay much attention to them, but not the end of the world. They're tough engines, and I have seen people run these with very little oil. Nonetheless, we're going to throw some 10 weight 40 in there and just top it up. Not paying too much attention, just want to make sure it's not running dry. Next up on my list of things to check is the compression. So this is the famous compression tester, the one that dictates whether your engine's healthy or not, and this threads straight into the barrel, which is great, and we're just going to kick this engine over. So this will give us an idea of whether the engine produces compression. One thing I noticed with this bike was that the throttle was very stuck, so the first few kicks are with the throttle closed, and you'll see I managed to wrangle the throttle open, which allows the compression to raise slightly. The numbers for this, as you can see here, we pushed around 80 psi. Obviously we'd want it a bit higher, but I see no reason why this wouldn't run at this compression level. So we've got compression, we know we've got oil now, and next up we need to check that we've got spark and fuel. So let's have a look at the spark and see if we can get something out of this engine. With no spark, it's time to go about diagnosing why we haven't got one. So I like to start stator side and just uncover and get a good idea of what I'm working with. With these bikes you have a stator and a point system on the left hand side of the engine, so it's good just to check that and, I don't know, familiarise yourself. Luckily the Z50 we did before is a very similar system, so I'm familiar with it, but we're pretty much just going to uncover all the parts we need access to diagnose this problem. With a few bolts removed, you get access to the flywheel, which give that a quick spin just to check sure it's smooth and there's nothing binding up. Underneath the seat is where the harness sits, or the rear bulk of the harness. What I'm doing now is looking around. One thing that I've noticed is there is no key for this bike, so obviously without a key you can't connect the switch essentially to allow you to get ignition, so we're going to have to look at a way to bypass that, and for now we've got no switch, so let's see what we can do with just a raw harness. Out comes the trusty climber manual, and we get up the CT70 wiring diagram. What I'm trying to do is familiarise myself with the system circuit and see if there's any wires missing, where everything's going, see if we've got any really obvious issues. You can see here you've got this connector which would go to a 6-volt battery. You don't need that to run the bike, so we're fine. Here is a switch that I do have, and what I want to do now is see if this switch can actually plug into this harness. So to do that you've got to get the fuel tank out, so we pop the fuel lines off the carb, drain all the fuel out. I'm going to change this fuel anyway, so no issue there. Get that all drained out and try not to make a mess, and yeah, work on pulling this fuel tank out. With the fuel drained, we move back up to the top of the bike and we've got this bracket to remove. This is what locates the fuel tank in place. I thought this bracket was separate from the fuel tank, and technically it is, but as you see here you can actually pull the tank out as one whole unit with the bracket attached. So the tank slides out the rear. Quite cool that it's a plastic tank. I was expecting it to be steel considering it's a 69 bike, but yeah, cool to see. And now what we've been looking for is to see the connector on the harness, and sadly, as I thought, we've got a 5-wire with a ground connector, and our connector on the ignition side is a 2-pin. Not to worry though, what we're going to do is completely bypass this, so we're going to put a wire through from the stator directly into our coil. So we're literally taking the ignition feed from the stator and passing that straight to the coil, bypassing everything. So simple wire with 2 terminals on each end, and we plug that in. These bikes are dead simple, so there's not too much to worry about, but we try to kick it over and I have no luck. So back to the drawing board where we will continue looking. The next place I want to look is the point system on these bikes, which are hidden behind the flywheel. So you've got 2 windows you can see through, but to get a good close look you need to pull off this flywheel. So flywheel puller goes in with an opposite thread, and then you wind in this nut through the middle and it pulls the flywheel off the shaft. Now here's the interesting bit, and I was blind to it at the start. Straight away looking at this, there is only 1 coil, and there should be 2. I don't know why. I thought I was not thinking. So we've got a primary coil, and then you have an accessory coil for your lights. We've only got 1, and the one we do have is for the lights. So simply put, we are missing a primary coil. Obviously at this point I had not realised, and I was cleaning the point system for something that did not have a coil. At this point I had 2 options. The first option being get a replacement coil for this area, which is definitely possible. My second option was to go for an electronic ignition system, and I chose the latter for a few reasons. I've got some future plans of this bike, and electronic ignition will make a big improvement. So I've gone away, I've ordered one, and we're going to tackle that in the next section. So whilst we're waiting for delivery of our new ignition system, I thought I would tackle the fuel side of this bike and get the carburetor stripped down and cleaned. The bike sits for a while, these get gummed up, and with tiny jets inside you can very easily find yourself with no fuel in the engine. But we get stripping down on this, we pull the slide out and the manifold off, and then we take it to the bench where we will start to strip it down. What's cool about this bike is the fact that it has so many original parts. This is an original carburetor, which is really cool to see, and you can tell the quality is just 10 times better than these reproduction ones you see. But here's a quick look around of how it looks now. Covered in mud. To be honest, for a bike this old, it's in pretty decent condition, but everything's a bit gummed up, mucky, and just needs a very good clean. But we get the 2 screws off the top, and that allows us to drop the float bolt off the bottom, and you can see straight away the float is actually made of metal opposed to the new plastic ones that you see. But it's not actually that bad. You've got loads of stale fuel inside and loads of bit of grit, but that's what we're going to tackle. We pop those jets out and I give them a blow through. They're actually pretty clean, but the next step, we're going to get the ultrasonic cleaner out and really give these a good clean. So the ultrasonic cleaner is a new bit of equipment for me, and it is perfect for jobs like this where you're cleaning small intricate parts covered in crap. Obviously you could do this by hand, but you're never going to get all the small particles out, and that's what really matters when cleaning something like this. So get the carb stripped down, we get it into this cage, and then we're going to fill it with carburetor cleaner. I think this is like a generic cleaning solution, but it's pretty good for carbs. Temperature wise, we have this thing turned up, so we're going for 60 degrees for half an hour, which turns out to be plenty and do a great job. So they've been baking away for half an hour. You can see the steam coming out, they're nice and hot, and we pull these parts out. First impressions, really good. One thing I did notice was that the aluminium cleaned but also tarnished. It was almost like you needed a brightener in there as well, but this gets the gunk off, and if I want to bring this back to new, we'll get it vapor blasted. But reverse procedure for fitting it up, just making sure that everything's clean and there's no bits of gunk sticking to it, and yeah, get the carb all back together. Now we can get this job ticked off and get it back on the bike. Once again, bolt the manifold up and get the throttle cable back together. I'm confident now that we're going to have a good fuel supply to the bike, so we'll go back to sorting this spark issue, and then hopefully we're in a position where we can get this thing running. So after about a week's wait, this parcel came in from Malaysia, and this is our electronic ignition kit, which is going to change our bike from the old point style to the new modern CDI system. There you go, our kit has arrived to take this bike and turn it from the standard points ignition to a full electronic ignition system. Now this may seem a bit premature fitting this now, but the main point for this, or part of this, is that I want to get this bike running. So we would be outside, but in standard British weather fashion it is pissing down my rain, so we're back in the shed and we're going to get this fitted and see if we can get a spark on this bike. With that unboxed, we start by taking the bike and positioning flat on its side. The reason for this is that I don't want to drop the oil, I want to keep that in there, and I want to be able to fit this stator plate. So by sticking on its side, you push all the oil to the other side of the engine, which allows you to work on the left hand side. Our flywheel comes off, which you've seen already before, nice and easy, and then we work on pulling the stator plate off. This is held in by 2 JIS screws with a seal in the middle around the crankshaft and a big O-ring around the outside. We're not too interested on what's going on inside the engine at this point, but we're just going to give it a good clean, make sure that the surface our O-ring will sit against is nice and clean, nothing to stop this part going in. But we start here by placing our 2 O-rings in for the screw point, and then we come in with the new electronic ignition system, which will drop straight into place like this. With a bit of wrestling, and we use the 2 screws to pull the new plate in. It's kind of a good thing, it fits really well and it needs to, as there's a seal around the outside. But we get that pulled in and the flywheel goes back on as it was before. Tightened up with the impact gun. In theory, this bike should make a spark. The rain started to wear off, although wet outside, so I thought let's get back outside with some better lighting and move forward with this project. So we start by getting the CDI box plugged in to the new stator system, and then we also plug in our red wire, which takes our power from the stator plate straight to our coil. And straight away, really happy, we've got spark. So great thing achieved, the stator plate works, and we've now got one more thing ticked off. With spark sorted, the next thing I wanted to move on to was the fuel. So we cleaned our carb in the first instance, but now it's time to get the fuel system back on, the fuel tank in, and fresh fuel running into this carb. So I thought this would be quite a simple job, just sliding that tank back in, but actually getting those fuel lines down through the frame is an absolute nightmare. So I decided to make it easy for myself and pop the air filter box off and trying to get that off, but that wouldn't come off without the carb coming off, so I ended up pulling the carb manifold off to allow me to remove that, and that just gives you a load of space to pass your fuel hose through. And to be honest, if I was building this when I'm restoring, it's exactly how I'll do it. Next up are the fuel lines to go back on. They are very brittle and hard, but for now they will do. A quick spray of silicone makes them slip on easier, which is ideal. And then back up top, we can now put fuel into this beast. So a cup of fuel is all it needs. We're not trying to run it for too long, we just want to see if this thing coughs and fires. So here we go, let's see if we have any luck. And I hate to break it to you, this does not fire at all. So after a lot more kicking of the bike, I was a bit baffled, so I went straight in with the carb cleaner and see if I could get a fire of any sorts. I've got a good spark, I've got fuel in there, I think I've got enough compression, so I was expecting something, but no matter what I did, fuel, checking the spark, I couldn't get this thing to fire. So first thing I did was run and get a new spark plug. I thought, even though sparking outside the cylinder, sometimes you get a weak spark and it will not spark inside the combustion chamber. So new spark plug, double check that it still had a good spark, which it did. One step further, cut back the HD lead to get some good connection and screw that all back together and try again. The new plug goes in, and after some testing I find out that that changes absolutely nothing, so I continue my search and move towards the mechanical timing on the engine. I haven't known the past or the history of this bike, so I thought let's just be sure. So pop that top cover and it all looks good. The timing marks from the cam sprocket line up with the head, so I was happy with that and could rule it off. What I wasn't sure about were valve clearances. On these old bikes they do need regular valve adjustment, so I pulled the top one, the intake side, and that felt alright, and moved to the bottom for the exhaust. Once I'd backed that off, it actually felt quite tight, which made me excited because I thought maybe it has always got a valve open and hence why we have poor compression and we're not firing. But with some adjustments I go back, get that all buttoned back up and give it another go, and as you can see here, no luck. It just really doesn't even sound like it's going to come to life. So guys, I'm going to end part one of this video here. As you've seen, we've been through a multitude of diagnosing and trying to fix this problem and get this bike to run, but unfortunately you can't win them all. So this bike hasn't run or fired. I'm putting the root cause down to lack of compression. So I know when we first got this bike we compression tested it and I made the comment that I thought it would run even though it was low. Textbook states 170 psi and obviously we were nowhere near that. I've spoken to a few people, spoken to a specialist of these engines, and he said we've got fuel, we know that, and I've had carb cleaner directly in the carb. I've got a good spark and we've seen that, and I've got my electronic ignition kit taking care of that. So it comes down to compression. So I think that's the big thing stopping this bike from running. But like I say, if we were going to keep this bike as it was, I'd strip the head down, look to replace this valves or piston rings, but as this bike's going to be fully restored and stripped, I think we will leave it there. It's not always great and it's not ideal, but it's part of the process. So hope you enjoyed that video. Bit of up and down, good bit of fun, but yeah, we'll get this thing stripped in the next episode and I will see you then. So take it easy and enjoy.